Okay, yeah. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Zach Hollander, a fellow here at the Center for Ethics. And Zach will talk today about Marcuse, King Jr. and Davis, from Domination to the Politics of Emancipation. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sergio. Thank you all for being here. Again, to reintroduce myself, my name is Zach Hollander. I'm a fellow here in the Center for Ethics, and I'm a third-year PhD in political theory within the Department of Political Science. Today, I'm going to be presenting broadly on my dissertation project and how it's currently conceived. Given that I am at the earlier stages of my research, I will not have the full answers to everything I'm exploring, but I hope to give you a certain idea, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions. I want to sort of start by situating this project and the fact that it's undergirded by the current world that we find ourselves in, one of crisis across multiple spheres of life and tremendous forms of violence and suffering, perhaps no better epitomized and embodied in the re-election of Donald Trump in the country I unfortunately call home, and the continued rise of far-right forces around the world that are contrasted with growing levels of inequality, a quickly escalating and destructive climate crisis, the demonization and attempted erasure of trans communities, and the devastation of Gaza and the West Bank with very unclear prospects for the future of the Palestinian people. All of this trails a rather horrible pandemic that we've quickly attempted to move past without really tarrying with its human toll, and what was at the time also one of the largest public racial reckonings and forms of mass protest in the US and around the world following the murder of George Floyd. These both, in part, then set the stage for the authoritarian oligarchic backlash that is now ransacking the US and what is left of its political institutions. I apologize for the rather depressing start, but it feels necessary to be clear-eyed about the political conditions we now face and the understandable sense of hopelessness or worse, nihilism that pervades our politics. It is pertinent to thinking through critically what we should be doing in response, or in the words of King, where do we go from here? As he asks, chaos or community, which seems to be a relevant frame. Is the effort of emancipation still desirable? I think it is, but it feels like it is far from our horizons. What do now counter-normative or counter-hegemonic practices even look like? How do we move from a critical stance that grasps something is wrong or something is missing, in the words of Ernst Bloch, to connect it with forms of social transformation that do not regressively respond to what's wrong? Fascism, white supremacist nationalism, Christian nationalism all have some sense that something is wrong, but they have a rather odious, dehumanizing interpretation of what the source of our unhappiness and discontent is. They do have a desire to alter ourselves, our practices, our norms, our structures, but premise that not on freedom, equality, or justice, at least not when critically analyzed, but atop unequal notions of the human and limited notions as to whose life has value and who it is we want to be free. This project then intends to focus on three key thinkers who are writing and acting in, or were subsequently inspired by, the political crises and social movements of the 1960s and 1970s. That is Herbert Marcuse, Martin Luther King Jr., and Angela Davis. So why this period of history, and why these three thinkers, both individually and in relationship to one another? I contend that thinking through and alongside these thinkers provides a useful framing device for capturing the political dynamics of interest, and importantly, I believe has resonance for our contemporary politics and current conjuncture that we find ourselves in. Set within the international context of the Cold War, the haunting specter of the Holocaust, and ever-present existential threats of nuclear annihilation, the 1960s and 70s were a time of political crisis and upheaval, including imperialist and neo-colonial wars, anti-colonial revolutions, scientific and technological advances that promised both progress and destruction, the material transformation and deepening of capitalist economies towards greater consumerism and what can be called the early manifestations of neoliberalism. And at the same time, we see burgeoning social movements striving for new forms of emancipation, spanning issues of race, class, gender, and ecology, to name but a few. It seemed like a time of tremendous uncertainty and tremendous possibility. It is also after this period that within, but certainly not limited to the US, we see what became one of the most successful conservative backlashes to various forms of socio-political progress and efforts at transforming the basic structures and institutions of the US, a backlash that I think continues to shape contemporary politics and forms of crisis. I think each of these thinkers provide not only analyses of domination and the politics of organizing against it, but also caution us as to how a left politics oriented broadly towards emancipation can fail to materialize those goals and fail to prevent or build power against ensuing backlashes. In part, Marcuse, King, and Davis argue that a failure to transform our character, our values, and the ways of relating to one another in tandem with structural changes to address the material bases of domination leaves political space for resurgent and novel forms of domination. Now, of course, both structural transformation and transformation of our values and norms has been rather elusive, at least by the standards and ideas set out by these three authors, and the degree to which the 50-plus years following the social movements of the 1960s and 70s have again represented a prolonged period of rather successful right-wing backlash. If anything, we seem very far from the calls for emancipation across different forms of life that circulated within the politics at the time. I therefore think these thinkers provide resources for thinking through the potentialities of progressive politics and the threat of a left politics that unsuccessfully builds coherent narratives and forms of mobilization against domination and inequality, both structurally and at the level of our values and relations with one another. As I intend to show, all three are in various ways committed to a dual project of critique. They provide not only diagnostic, critical insight into the drivers and mechanisms of domination and its forms of instrumentalization and subjectification, but they also orient the subject and their subjectivities towards types of actions and questions of what can and should be done. That is, our subject status is not entirely foreclosed despite the totalization that domination tends towards. A possibility of reorienting our consciousness within certain social conditions is not impossible. I see each then as undertaking distinct yet overlapping forms of critique that identify contradictions and potentialities within prevailing forms of domination and specify oppositional discourses and practices that specifically seek to change how we perceive and move through the world. Their critique takes on a form of negativity or refusal in thought and practice that then seeks to destabilize forms of domination and open our subjectivities towards political possibilities in the pursuit of emancipation. The refusal still allows for a positing of new values and new modes of being and relating. In varying ways, understanding what we should do occurs not only in thought and reflecting, but in the critical praxis itself, in the act of resistance, which comes to represent a force of transforming the subject and the world around them, in part through negating and enacting new modes of relating. Yet, I think what we see in each is also a sense that a shift in consciousness, a shift in our perceptions, or our understanding of a problem does not necessarily translate into a shift in our action, our behavior, or how we orient to the world. Of course, not all action is successful, depending on how you define success. And now, while we may diagnose domination as relying upon or reproducing itself through a dominant class's ignorance of underlying violence, there is perhaps a deeper and more interesting question of our action in relation to actually what we do know. Many normal people, regular people, are willing to look past and ignore practices of domination so long as it does not materially impact them. That is, there's a question of when we are confronted with and aware of violence and domination, whether in an everyday form, say embodied in the person experiencing homelessness on a downtown street corner, or when it is plastered across our social media feeds, newspaper headlines, and cable news coverage. Domination is mediated in different ways through our technological devices, which provide some forms of immediacy and abstraction, and through our own cognitive ideational structures of perception and relation. As such, it is not always a question of knowing or overcoming ignorance and then acting, but also our capacities to act in relationship to what we perceive and how we perceive it. More deeply, what we perceive in forms of consciousness are embedded in specific social practices and specific historical conditions, which can also come to be normalized. It's also of no novelty to say that these three thinkers, in their own ways, embodied a unique movement between thought, reflection, and action. In interesting ways, each did, and in the case of Davis, continue to, place their own bodies on the line, and thus intertwining in unique ways their theoretical orientations and their practices. All were a part of and deeply impacted by the movements of their time, which not only provided unique insights into their political theoretical work, but themselves served to blur or complicate any neat division between theory and practice. If anything, each explicitly or implicitly used their platforms as educators, students, and actors in the traditions of political thought and philosophy to reflect on the history of the present and the role of the intellect in understanding and furthering just causes. From the perspective of the university, this is perhaps most clearly seen in the work of Marcuse and Davis, but MLK Jr. was of course no stranger to the university with a history of philosophy, and many of his written works and public addresses made constant reference and drew upon a broad array of philosophical and theological texts and traditions. Okay, to start off, how am I thinking about the notion of domination? To say that domination is a source of unfreedom is one thing, but of what sort? It goes beyond, I think, to say it's unfreedom as a form of interference, of material or physical constraint on what we individually can do, such that then freedom means non-interference or non-constraint in the sort of liberal tradition. Domination can, of course, entail violence, coercion, and direct constraint, but it also works to control our time, as has been so wonderfully argued by William Paris in his newest book, and control our ability to collectively determine the norms and basis of our forms of life. Psychosocially, it can also degrade a sense of our agency and potentially personhood for individuals subject to domination. To say that domination is a source of unfreedom is to not only say that it controls in some way the lives of those who are dominated and their practices as they exist in time, but to also say that it makes one feel as if they have no agency or control. It can induce a type of helplessness and an effective winnowing of the sense of what is possible through concerted effort and coordinated action with others. As I go on to show with the three thinkers, and as I've mentioned, domination does something to our perception and our consciousness in relationship to oneself and in relationship to others. In undermining forms of time and action, it limits our potential to create, to determine our relations with others, and the constitution of oneself through free and equal social relationships. The core insight I hope to distill and subsequently develop through the work of Marcuse, King, and Davis is how domination operates to control our time and possibilities for self-determination across three distinct yet interrelated spheres: the psychosocial, the ideological, and the structural. Enumerating each of these is key for understanding how the three theorists of interest conceptualize domination, its determinate political effects, and importantly, resistance against it and towards emancipation. A project of emancipation necessitates forms of critique to understand the contours of what it is that makes us unfree. Emancipation, or a project of freedom, requires a diagnosis of what, in the objective conditions of social life, inhibit, constrain, or mutilate the subject and their capacities individually or collectively. Yet, in its commitment to opening the world to normative and political judgment about the operations of power or illegitimate and legitimate forms of life, critical theory ought to also leave space for things to be otherwise, for political practices that could bring out an alternative set of social relations, subjectivities, and forms of life. Okay, I'm now going to turn to each of the three thinkers and sort of briefly provide an overview of what I'm drawing from them. Starting with Marcuse. Marcuse operates a sort of unique space in the history of the Frankfurt School and critical theory. He's sort of known as the critical theorist of the 1960s social movements, and yet I have found that he is not really widely read anymore. And this could be for a number of reasons that I'm not going to go into here, but nevertheless, I do find him to be an intriguing and an insightful theorist to turn to. Marcuse, ever the dialectical Marxist, saw the industrial capitalism of the 1960s as rife with contradiction, yet ever more stabilized and ideologically reproduced. Marcuse saw tremendous scientific technological progress and possibilities for truly abolishing material poverty and need, juxtaposed with ecological devastation, neo-colonial expansionism, and the ever-present risk of nuclear annihilation. The productive capacity of industrialized societies captured for Marcuse both the irrationality of contemporary society that perpetuated selective or unequal scarcity and violence in the name of things like national security, efficiency, and economic growth, which was really captured in Marcuse's sense that the irrational had become rational. He saw the zenith of which was represented in the concept of mutually assured destruction. But this existed alongside the possibility for reclaiming and practicing our rational and effective sensibilities towards abolishing hardship, unnecessary labor, forms of suffering, towards free time. Marcuse's most well-known work, One-Dimensional Man, argues that capitalism has been able to variably absorb challenges to its operation and flatten our perception of the world such that it is unable to identify, see, or act against the contradictions as they emerge. At the time of Marcuse's writing, capitalism had evolved ever more efficient modes of production that were able to provide the goods on a larger scale than ever before. Capitalism was not fully immiserating the working class, but it had instead integrated the historic subject of Marxist theory and revolution, the proletariat, despite at the same time its ever more efficient modes of exploitation and alienation that subsumed us to the productive process and processes of capital accumulation. In this unfreedom from Marcuse, we are convinced that we are free, told that the freedom to act and consume in a marketplace was one of the highest achievements in all that we could expect. On this basis, capitalism was able to seemingly absorb or deflect its own contradictions and prevent qualitative challenges to its smooth facade and claims to freedom, while at the same time necessitating forms of authoritarianism domestically and internationally underneath a superficial veneer of liberal democracy. It also developed modes of selling its own crisis, of commodifying its own failures. This one-dimensional world, as Marcuse calls it, is a foreclosed world where people resign themselves or actively embrace the world as it is. It becomes easier to turn inward, to treat oneself as an alienated subject rather than exert oneself to try and get freer. We can always comfort ourselves with forms of material goods, ever marketed to our needs and our anxieties. It is therefore a falsely fixed, naturalized world that despite its crises or inhumanities, stabilizes itself and maintains an ideological sense that this is all that we can hope for. It is a world that in its reification, it also turns us from the violence inflicted upon others who are easily regarded as things. This hyper-commodification of the world made us more reliant on the market and saturated different forms of relationality with market sensibilities and market ethics. Our sensibilities for Marcuse are hardened, consigned to the world of facticity and turned away from one another, others suffering, and therefore making solidarity all the more difficult to achieve, in tandem with the vested, often atomizing interests we develop in the material reproduction of capitalism and its goods. Marcuse then seeks to understand how these forces of domination within capitalist society prevent or hinder our collective ability to desire and act towards non-authoritarian forms of labor and politics against domination. He sees that this form of capitalism and its power also induces an attachment to the fetishized commodity form at the psychic level. Capitalism had achieved a point of being able to alter the consciousness and the instincts of the subject. In its attempt to sort of smooth over its problems and its contradictions and the ever insatiable need for expansion into new forms of life, capitalism produces a distinct form of the subject. The competitive, acquisitive, aggressive values underlying capitalism come to represent desired norms and values which corrupt or distort what Marcuse sees as a tendential orientation towards eros and solidarity. We are driven towards mundanity, exploitation, greater consumption, forms of what Marcuse calls repressive desublimation, as opposed towards solidarity, truly encountering one another in loving relations. We see in Marcuse domination that operates across scales, structural and psychosocial, that therefore has to be resisted at different levels. And so if we accept that capitalism does produce a particular introjection of the subject that fractures solidarity, then the question of what should be done in response takes on something deeper than, say, simply changing our laws or institutions. Marcuse does see the possibility for the reorientation of our sensibilities and our reason as a component of individual and political liberation through new forms of praxis. This new sensibility, as he calls it, entails a shift in our relations to nature and our needs, and what he says is a break with the familiar experience of the world with our mutilated sensibility. Marcuse then theorizes the need for new methods of thinking, of reasoning, perceiving, and working to build what he calls a qualitatively different society premised on association, solidarity, and care. Socialism for Marcuse was not simply new forms of production or redistributing what it is that we produce. Instead, it existed within the historical conditions of capitalism in that we are able to produce what it is that we need and what we want in abundance. But instead, socialism is the ability to reflect on the ends of our activity and to experience the world and our relations with one another in new terms and in new ways. As he writes, revolutionary forces emerge in the process of change itself. The translation of the potential into the actual is the work of political practice. He saw this potential, imperfect and incomplete, within the 1960s and 1970s student, feminist, ecological, and civil rights movements that he theorized were changing, or at least challenging, these second natures that were built atop the values of competition, violence, and destruction. What he identifies in these movements was a form of refusal or negation. That is, a refusal to accept the establishment, which was sort of the nexus of norms, values, institutions, and practices of bourgeois capitalist society, and its authoritarian dimensions, which produce and reproduce domination and violence. This refusal was necessary in order to break with the hold of domination over the subject's consciousness and to open ourselves to the real possibilities of building a society that values life rather than negating it. It was this refusal against domination and exploitation and towards tenderness, care, and affect, non-alienation, that solidarity could be instantiated in small efforts and spontaneous forms of organization. But what he ultimately says is that spontaneity by itself cannot possibly be a radical and revolutionary force. It must turn into forms of organization that transforms the basis of our labor. It is the liberation of our senses and affect towards solidaristic communion that holds the potential for transforming the subject, but this transformation must carry forth, parallel, and potentially follow a transformation of the objective conditions of domination. For Marcuse, this necessitates a transformation of our needs in relationship to time, both of which undergird our ability to act freely and to determine our determinate social conditions in relation with others. The sort of failure of this dialectic can be seen in his evaluation of some parts of the hippie movement that represented a form of negation premised on solidarity or love, but without larger scale goals of transforming the conditions of domination. It was a one-sided form of freedom in some respect, one which remained more subjective without the organizational work to turn into a more objective condition of freedom outside the limited bounds of the community. It did refuse some form of integration with the status quo, and it posited new values from which to live, but it did not move beyond that in some respect. He also sees this failure on the flip side in the USSR, a project that he quickly came to see not as representing the emancipation of the working class, but instead as a form of sclerotic, bureaucratized authoritarianism that contradicted the true ends of democratic socialism. So absent a kind of transformation of ourself in relationship to the politics that we are building, Marcuse thinks that we will not only be able to construct the political will to abolish forms of poverty and aggression, but will end up reproducing domination in our sociopolitical, ecological, and interpersonal relationships. It's also this that in his later work in the 1970s underpinned his sense of where the left did not materially or psychologically induce the necessary changes to combat what became what he calls the conservative counter-revolution and its new authoritarian neo-fascist elements as he recognized them. It was not that the desire to necessarily change the subject was unnecessary, but rather done in isolation or without a clear mode of altering our larger forms of life and practices, and without a full critical understanding of the specific role of capitalism and the difficulty, if not impossibility, of truly instantiating loving, solidaristic relations would be denied. Okay. I'm now turning to King. King provides us with an ethic of non-domination premised upon a life-affirming society. An orientation towards flourishing and well-being in and against racialized instrumentalization, or what he calls the thing-oriented society. His positive conception of freedom is premised in part on equal participation in social and political decisions that set the bounds for free action, but it is those bounds that must be challenged and reformed. While King undeniably focused attention philosophically and politically on transforming the institutions of racial domination within the US, he consistently concerned himself with the transformation of character necessary to abolish white supremacy and racial inequality. For King, it did not make sense to only enact legal changes, for example, without questioning and challenging racial domination as it existed within the psyche of the American public. We see this in King's 1963 letter from Birmingham City Jail, where the white moderate is more devoted to order than to justice. The white moderate prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. As he goes on to say, shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. Racial domination has not then only winnowed true emancipation for the dominated, but has captured the consciousness of the dominant, those who are unbothered or unsettled more by the direct action and efforts at emancipation from the oppressed than they are at the domination itself, its forms of violence, and its sociopolitical and material deprivations that it entails. This, for King, has a material and an ideological basis. As King later writes in reflecting on the backlash to the civil rights movement in Where Do We Go From Here, he writes, "It appears that the white segregationist and the ordinary white citizen had more in common with one another than either had with the Negro." King goes on to say, "The majority of white Americans consider themselves sincerely committed to justice for the Black subject. They believe that American society is essentially hospitable to fair play and to steady growth towards a middle-class utopia embodying racial harmony. But unfortunately, this is a fantasy of self-deception and comfortable vanity. Overwhelmingly, America is still struggling with irresolution and contradictions. It has been sincere and even ardent in welcoming some change, but too quickly apathy and disinterest rise to the surface when the next logical steps are to be taken." Here, King is critiquing the sort of ideology of underlying meritocracy and fairness within the US, and a belief that guaranteeing a middle-class life will simply do away with the contradictions and tensions of white supremacy. It is, as King calls it, a self-deception, and it importantly allows for a comfortable vanity, a self-protective mechanism that entails no deeper look at the self or entails no commitment to broader transformation and to relinquishing oneself of not only their psychic attachments to white supremacy, but crucially, the advantage they retain structurally, politically, economically, by remaining committed to a middle-class utopianism. For King, it's not a matter of coming to truth or seeing the realities of both injustice and inequality and the actual fact of Black humanity and equality. Racism is not a matter of ignorance, nor is it something that's ingrained, but it's historically specific and it's tied to other structures in American society. Challenging it requires a move out of the self in some respect, to actually challenge then the material bases of injustice and inequality, a move that calls for whites to go beyond acknowledgement to actually subverting the system of racial domination that grants them multitudinous advantages. This is very then resonant with scholars such as Melvin Rogers and Jenny Yakuta, who argue, using James Baldwin, that contemporary white politics of acknowledging racism or their implication within systems of racial domination that's very popular, especially amongst liberal progressive white people, does not actually encourage action to then deconstruct racial domination. Jenny Yakuta argues that this commitment to racial inequality through what becomes a politics of disavowal does not actually motivate deeper political action against racial domination, and it allows for whites to deflect responsibility and attachments to racial domination in its political and material advantages. As King similarly argues, the sincerity behind a commitment to racial justice and acknowledgement is true, but it is fickle and easily extinguished. It is the ideological and material attachment to middle-classness that for King, or the idea that America is open to fairness, which severs the white subject from actually confronting and challenging the structural political economic features that maintain Black injustice. In some respect, we see an interesting tie to Marcuse here. There's a sense that we've become too comfortable or too tied to a particular form of life that we are unwilling to challenge or to redistribute and reconfigure its power relations. We become habituated to the structures of domination, both consciously and unconsciously. Moreover, aside from acknowledgement and perhaps genuine commitment, King says, no substantial fervor survives the formal signing of legislation. The recording of the law in itself is treated as of the reality of the reform. King goes on to say the practical cost of change for the nation up to this point has been cheap. The limited reforms have been obtained at bargain rates. There are no expenses, no taxes required for Black subjects to share lunch counters, libraries, parks, hotels, and other facilities with whites. Even the psychological adjustment is far from formidable. Having exaggerated the emotional difficulties for decades, when demands for new conduct become inescapable, white Southerners may have trembled under the strain, but they did not collapse. King here is not only critiquing the idea of a simplistic integration, arguing that it was necessary but insufficient to dismantling racial hierarchy. There has been neither large monetary nor psychological sacrifice from whites, yet the perception thereof fueled backlash and a sense that Black subjects were asking for too much or they were not grateful for what they had been given. King then provides us with salient insights into the failures of legal reforms to transform the moral conscience and psychology of most white Americans. This failure and the resulting backlash that King does acknowledge has been the rule rather than the exception for Black struggles to become free and equal, not only inhibited successful implementation of the civil rights agenda in both the North and the South, but also furthered the ideological project of imperialistic expansionism and neocolonial wars. King then situates his critique of American militarism within a long thread of violence that has undergirded the American project and within a political economic structure that is unable or unwilling to dedicate the resources necessary in an otherwise techno-scientifically advanced and affluent nation to truly achieve equality and abolish poverty. In this way, I don't think that we can neatly dichotomize King's work before the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 1965, where King is sort of seen as overwhelmingly focusing on racism and white supremacy, and the post-1965 King, who then turns to imperialism, militarism, poverty, and socioeconomic inequality. Many of these concerns that animate his later work and activism are visible in his earlier writings. This also aligns with a reading of King as a particular theorist of racial capitalism and the racialized inequalities built into American political economy. King sees how capitalism's forms of exploitation magnify racial inequalities while convincing poor whites that they are racially superior to Blacks and therefore needn't forge solidarity in the pursuit of economic justice. He has an analysis that's quite reminiscent of Du Bois's Wages of Whiteness, whereby whiteness served as a form of compensation for poor white workers, thereby maintaining disaggregated forms of racial and class-based exploitation and undermining working class solidarity. It was on this basis, following the successes of the civil rights movement and passing the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, that King then does take a more anti-imperial stance and develops an anti-poverty politics that is tied to his anti-Vietnam War stance, calling for a revolution of values that are premised upon a new way of viewing our mutual relationality. Like Marcuse, King saw that absent a shift in our system of values and a movement to overcome domination, technological and economic progress would not translate into a better, more just, or freer world, but would be used to deepen domination and carry out violence both domestically and abroad, while avoiding confrontation with the actual conditions of material inequality and want. Absent a shift in the value system undergirding American political economy and politics, one built on a schism between technological progress and ever greater abundance on the one hand, and ever-growing repression and violence, and the possibility of self-destruction on the other, racism and inequality would simply mutate into new forms of life. From this, direct action, obviously, for King was a crucial element in this transformation. For Black subjects, it was not only a clear articulation of their personhood, of their status, not as things or objects, commodities to be bought and sold, but as active historical agents. He writes that the Black subject under Jim Crow existed in a state of no-bodiness, a form of social, political, and material death, and the negation of which was somebodiness, of enacting and putting oneself into the world through struggles to get free. Direct action served to confront the consciousness of the dominant with the claims and weight of the individual standing before them, who often were then subject to immense repression. Praxis was, of course, practical in some sense. That was, it was oriented towards materially challenging white supremacy, forms of violence, and then enacting legislative reform, but it also took on an existential value for King. It was not just acting, but it was critically reflecting upon one's conditions, in part enabled through acting, that then oriented us towards where we ought to go, or to see the contradictions and ideological justifications within a particular form of domination. I see this all as then culminating in King's last project before his assassination in April 1968, which was the Poor People's Campaign, a somewhat understudied component of the post-civil rights movement and King's activism, not only King's activism. From the perspective of political practice, the Poor People's Campaign represented an attempt to forge class-based interracial solidarity that centered the needs and material conditions of the poor and was built on a material form of world building, premised not only on the agential capacities of the poor, often denied or vilified in popular political discourse, but on the direct reclamation of space and forms of self-governance practice at the core of US power, which was the National Mall. Desegregation and the right to vote were essential, but King believed that African Americans and other minorities would never enter full citizenship until they had economic security. Through direct action, King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference hoped to then focus the nation's attention on economic inequality and poverty. King described the campaign as the beginning of new cooperation, understanding, and a determination by poor people of all colors and backgrounds to assert and win their right to a decent life and respect for their culture and dignity. Resurrection City, as it was called, lasted over a month before it was then broken up. All right. Now, lastly, move to Davis. A student of Marcuse's, Angela Davis is perhaps most well known for her work on prison abolition, which seemingly had its moment come and go, and the continued legacy of racial and gendered violence within capitalist societies captured by the modern carceral state. The prison industrial complex, as a continuation of racialized slavery, situated within the legacy of white supremacy and domination over Black and non-Black subjects, Davis then looks to the norms and practices which legitimize, justify, and uphold the carceral state, while also identifying the grip such forms of domination have over the consciousness of the American public. The prison, as an instantiation of legal state-sanctioned racism, is also a form of social death, that the prison, despite its confinement of the subject outside the realm of our cognition and geographical phenomenological experience, also, in removing the subject, it reflects back on us as co-citizens. It is a source of and built off of a deep insensitivity to suffering of others. Her critique identifies the racial material and ideological grounds for constructing and expanding the violent carceral state while providing a vision and practice of abolition that is premised upon a transformation of the political, economic, and normative structures within the US, especially around the distribution and material and discursive concepts of safety and security that she conceptualized as always being one-sidedly conceived and deeply racialized concept. The pursuit of an effective communal and individual sense of safety has been undergirded by an exertion of unequal degrees of racialized class and gendered violence that then reproduces forms of domination and exploitation. Abolitionism, then, is not only a positive conception of safety through freedom, but necessitates a theoretical and material negation of the conditions which, in its analysis, produce crime. Davis argues that racism itself has inscribed itself on the institutions such as the carceral state that are then reproduced at the interpersonal level. Davis claims that racism in the US exists in a psychic reservoir, and it emerges in various subversive ideologies and logics that inform the way all of us relate to the world. For Davis, then, we must consciousnessize the effects of the more subtle, non-legal forms of racism that have evolved since the 1960s and work across different social groups in differentiated and compounded ways. For Davis, absent specifically intersectional forms of praxis, different forms of oppression will be reinstituted in novel ways in the structures we continually affirm and create as exemplified in the prison industrial complex. Abolition attempts to cultivate a society that not only reflects an altered consciousness regarding criminality and incarceration, but in the words of Davis, involves the creation of new institutions that will effectively speak to the social problems that lead people to prison. Abolition for Davis is about constructing the institutions of a just society that intervene within the production of criminality and relatedly racial inequality. To decarcerate and abolish the prison system is to alter our consciousness and perception as to the purpose and drivers behind crime, as well as the racist structures that constitute the historically embedded carceral state. Abolitionist struggles challenge the idea of crime or prisons as fixed or natural phenomena, or forms of life that entail punishment. Instead, crime should be understood sociologically as combining the structures of race, class, and gender within an overarching political economy that fails to ensure housing, stable and secure employment, healthcare, education, and overall welfare. The prison system, which has become increasingly a source of its own capital accumulation, absorbs resources that would be necessary to prevent people from going to prison in the first place, such that the prison, in Davis's words, reproduces the conditions of its own expansion, creating a syndrome of self-perpetuation. The prison comes to stand in for a solution to inequality that is actually induced by patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism, instead transforming itself into a social and political and spatial fix that is easier to swallow than material transformations despite its forms of violence. While we relegate incarcerated individuals to a no place of sorts, it is a way we disavow our mutual responsibility to one another and fail to subvert individually and structurally sources of continued racial, class, and gender domination. The response for Davis is to then inculcate a consciousness of common connection and interdependence that grasps the intersections at these psychic and material levels. Across Davis's work, she draws our attention to different forms of Black struggle undertaken by women, Black women performing domestic work, Black sanitation workers, Black poor and working class forms of organization, where Davis finds different seeds and locuses of emancipatory intersectional praxis. Intersectional practice and struggle became a key form of ideology critique and an emancipation of the consciousness that you can find in the long history of various socio and political struggles. Struggle for Davis serves not only the crucial element of getting free, but is a part of the process of reorienting ourselves against domination and forms of violence that range from the spectacular to the everyday and routine. Practices of struggle and refusal challenge and emancipate us from psychosocial and material domination, which create forms of habituation that parallel lines of stratification and differentiation. Social struggle itself gives rise to a particular consciousness that relates differently to a world of domination and destabilizes its seemingly unshakable nature. As Davis writes, praxis serves as the ground through which social realities are seen to be malleable and transformable. It is resistance that sets in motion a new recognition of the self internally and desire to reshape the world externally. Davis discusses this in her 1971 lecture on Frederick Douglass's autobiography. She starts by saying a tension emerges between the subjective and objective experiences of the world. A growing consciousness of alienation engendered through resistance in the world then sparks a refusal to accept such alienation or the conditions which produce it, language that also explicitly mirrors that of Marcuse's. Yet, this rejection can not only be individual, it must be collective. It is not only the desire to negate one's own concrete conditions of unfreedom, but to negate that which produces such conditions and which functions to alienate and oppress all others in similar positions. In this way, emancipation can never just be individual, nor can it take place only within the individual's consciousness. It is only with the abolition of the very structure and institution of oppression that one can overcome such alienation. To resist is to introduce tension and friction into the world, which we also find in Marcuse and King. Resistance as a form of praxis disturbs the normal functioning and smooth facade of a status quo which grinds people underneath its normal functionality. As Davis concludes, in the process of functioning in the world, the subject undergoes changes himself which are consonant with his actions. That is, man cannot perform a task in the world without himself being affected by that performance. All right, finishing up. What are sort of the broad lessons and ways I'm thinking about all of this? We see one, that there is an assumed challenge to domination through the alteration of our practices and an alteration of our consciousness in the process. In reflecting and acting differently, there is a presumed possibility for the subject to liberate themselves from functions of domination, and if routed then through collective action, can result in collective liberation and transformation. That is, practice seems to serve a crucial function of helping us discern that which is actually not negotiable or fixed within the world versus that which is historically situated and contingent, which forms of domination often seek to ideologically establish as simply the way things are. It is in these mundane, sometimes mundane spaces of protest and political action that we challenge different forms of political vocabulary, the discourses, the reasons that undergird domination, and allow us to judge that which might be possible and desirable in the realm of political world-making and collective determination. It is this which King called our ability to shape a new world. In carving out these spaces of difference and alternative praxis, the totalizing tendencies of domination can be confronted and challenged, demonstrating at least the possibility that another world could be possible. In acting differently or outside the bounds of normality or that which is reified and normatively justified, practice can serve alongside critique to destabilize and defamiliarize that which we've become accustomed to living with and accepting, or even actively valuing. It is not acting without reflection or purpose, as all three of these thinkers make very clear. But these political practices can serve as important exemplifiers of agency, solidarity, grounded hope, and can feed into political imaginaries that seek to transcend our conditions of domination and route ourselves towards liberatory action. It can represent refusals that not only emerge imminently in response to social conditions of domination, but contain within them tendencies for emancipation from a given form of life and towards something new, more just, and more free. It allows for a transformation of our consciousness and perception, not away from this world, but towards a form of multi-dimensional depth perception, with one eye critically on the here and now and one eye towards what could be. A few final caveats for this project. In situating this project around the three thinkers that I've talked about, engaged in the politics and thought of the 1960s and 1970s, I want to ensure I do not provide a romanticized, nostalgic view of either these thinkers or the historical period. In some respect, our contemporary moment and the persistence of concerns and inequalities that mark the 60s and 70s showcase the gap in the critical capacities and actions of the time towards longer-term transformation. There were undoubtedly victories for the left and those committed to democracy, racial, gender, ecological, and economic justice, but that is only part of the story. And needless to say, those victories were achieved through tremendous effort, organizing, and against profuse violence which has in many ways been routed through new and old avenues, institutions, and mechanisms. Moreover, I don't mean to distill this dense epoch into the thought of three particular thinkers, each of whom have been reclaimed and reinterpreted in thought and in action in a myriad of ways that they lack control over. This is more pertinent to Marcuse and King than Davis, who is obviously still alive, writing, acting, and able to provide her own narration to her own work. I do not mean to reproduce the presumably innocent but nevertheless common narrative that the civil rights movement, for example, was largely the work of King, or that Davis ought to be the primary Black feminist we read to understand the activism of Black women, the feminist movement, or what emerged and grew into the contemporary movement for prison abolition. Or that Marcuse is the critical theorist of the 1960s and 70s and its social revolutions. These are labels that they would very likely deny, and instead turn our attention to the many individuals and collectives involved in the grinding work of social change and the degree to which all theory is deeply historical. Yet, I do take seriously how my work may inadvertently fit within a rather simplistic narrative that overly idealizes individual thinkers and actors at the expense of many others we both know and do not know about. Instead, I focus on these three thinkers, in their similarities and in their differences, tied to this particular temporal framing to hopefully draw theoretical insights into the reproduction of domination and the various ways we may attempt to resist it individually and collectively. I want to thread the needle between revivifying some of their insights and preventing an entombing that relegates them to this not-so-distant past, while also avoiding a claim that they provide the solution to our contemporary crises and dilemmas. In the words of Davis when she was reflecting on her mentor Marcuse, I hope to draw upon the useful aspects of the past in order to put these ideas to work in the present. I use this history and these thinkers not to necessarily figure out what we ought to do in the present, or to say that their responses to their own social conditions necessarily map to our current conditions, but rather to sharpen our conceptual and political insights for understanding and moving through the present. I contend that we cannot really understand this present without thinking about the politics of the 1960s and 70s and its surplus possibilities, struggles, and failures. Lastly, placing these three thinkers in relation to one another is not without potential tension or discrepancies in how they conceptualize and theorize responses to domination. Perhaps the biggest and most apparent tension emerges between Davis and Marcuse on the one hand and King on the other. King, contra Marcuse and Davis, was not a Marxist. He saw his theological commitments at odds with what was permissible in Marxist theory or communist society. He did not think that communism was an actual enemy to the US, and his anti-imperialism grew in response to the Vietnam War and the irrational, immoral justification of launching a devastating war against the poor colonized people in order to stop communism. Nevertheless, I see that he does not pull on or engage with the Marxist tradition in his writing and activism in the way that Marcuse and Davis both do, but he sees the Marxist project as aligned with social justice. This theological dimension is also undoubtedly integral to King's thought and praxis in a way that puts him at odds with Davis and Marcuse. But I still find that King belongs in a peculiar way to a broad tradition of critical theory, which is itself always in flux. I think King's theological worldview engendered a different language of critique, which is very much within the sort of history of the prophetic and Black tradition, but that took on quite radical dimensions and forms of direct action, perhaps more than is sometimes recognized. Davis, for her part, in her activism, was part of the Black Panthers, who at times disagreed with King and other elements of the civil rights movement and post-civil rights movement regarding tactics and vision. Nor do I also see King and Davis and Marcuse, as simply engaging with and expanding upon the other. Davis found Marcuse's approach to lack a consistent commitment to intersectionality, with Davis going further than Marcuse in bringing together Black feminist traditions with Marxism. This, for Davis, again, was key to determining the different nodes of critical analysis and revolutionary potential. All that said, I find these tensions to be potentially theoretically fruitful as explorations of the dimensions of domination and the work of emancipation. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
5 minutes break, so we'll come back just before 1:10.